kind of result you expect from a die like this, even when it's strictly less likely, even when it can't happen unless the other sequence happens. And so this is the sort of technique you use to look at a bias from another angle. Go ahead.
Did you just say that sequence 2 is more likely?
No, sequence 1 is more likely.
Yes, but I thought you also said that sequence 2 is more likely than sequence 3.
Yes, it is. But sequence 1 is more likely than sequence 2.
I know that sequence 1 is, it's a shorter sequence, but why is sequence 2 more likely than
because the die has 4 green faces, but only 2 red faces.
Oh, right. Yes.
So the red position is more likely. Thank you very much. I really appreciate being able to answer a question like that directly when I don't make something clear, so thank you. Yes, so people's bias towards choosing a representative sequence made them choose the less likely thing and miss out $25. Go ahead, sorry.
Is that a bias so much as just people going for they see the green, oh, there's more green in that one, I'm going to choose that one, and then they don't think beyond that. They don't notice that the pattern is the same between the persons.
Well, that's kind of, well, it depends.
Heuristic.
Yeah, it depends what you mean by a bias. You can call it a heuristic. People are applying the rule, as you say, and you can describe something about the rule they're applying. You can say, well, this has got more green, it's more representative. But they're making the wrong, they have all the information they need to make the right decision, and yet they're making the wrong decision.
And people just don't perceive sometimes. I mean, they're not paying attention.
Well, sure, but that's exactly. But the point is the ways in which they make these mistakes are not just random. Right. They don't just get it wrong sometimes. You can say people choose the more representative sequence over the more likely sequence. And you can experiment on this 22 different ways, and you find over and over again that when people bring to mind. Go ahead.
But isn't this just representing the fact that most people think and navigate the world inductively rather than deductively? And that is necessary to be able to make the quick fire decisions that we do to not walk into a wall and to do various things.
It's not clear. No, I don't know if it's clear that it's necessary for us to make mistakes like this in order to reason inductively. I don't know if it'd be obvious. I don't think that's obvious.
But it might be that in the simpler environment in which we evolved,
yes,
that kind of choose the representation, the most representative thing, was a better survival technique.
Well, it's
now that we're in a more complex environment, extrapolating from that lets us down more often.
Yes, I agree exactly with that. Yes, go ahead, sorry.
I got it wrong for an even more stupid reason.
Oh yeah.
I assumed that there are equal numbers of throws.
In all sequences, yeah.
I just counted the G's.
I didn't quite have time to. I wanted to do them with little, little squares with R and G written on them, so it looked nice. But I didn't quite have time for that.
Another possibility when I got the wrong answer is when I thought I knew the right answer, I didn't look any further. I stopped. So when I saw the sequence on the left was shorter, I thought that's the answer. If I wasn't sure, I'd probably have read the text above and realised that the green and red are not the same probability, and I might have looked further.
Yes.
So once someone thinks they know the answer, that may stop them looking in more detail.
It does. I mean, we know that it does. In fact, I'm coming to that later. Sorry, go ahead.
That's a question, but I don't quite understand why do you call it a representation bias? I don't understand the etymology of the name.
There's a sense in which, I guess, representativeness covers the sense in which if you wanted to give somebody a sense of what might happen, if you wanted to tell them a story that would give them a sense of the sort of thing that happens, you would choose the second sequence over the first, because the green tends to come up more often, and it's a better representation of the kind of result you might get from this dice. It's a story that tells you more accurately the sort of thing this dice tends to do. It's got more green in it, so it's much more like the kind of thing, the kind of rolls this dice tends to give you.
Also, the first example, the Russia invading Poland thing, is another example of the same thing.
Yeah, suspension of diplomatic relations isn't much of a story. It's just an event that can happen. Whereas a Russian invasion of Poland, it's a story. It's a representation of something that might happen. It sort of fits into your head as something you might plausibly tell someone about something that might happen. Whereas just this bare fact of a suspension of diplomatic relations doesn't have the same. It doesn't seem to represent the sort of thing that happens in diplomatic relations in the same way, because it doesn't fit together. And so the more representative story. I mean, for the whole details, I recommend the paper. I'll put on a bibliography at the end. But it's, yeah.
What would be another example of a representation bias?
Let me find one from the paper, to be honest.
Paul, could you use an example to do with sort of natural kinds, the way if you want a typicality, like if you wanted to show somebody what a typical bird was like, you point to a sparrow rather than an ostrich.
Or a penguin.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so even if
what does that?
Yeah, I don't know if that one's been tested in terms of how it brings about a conjunction bias. I'm sure you could do it.
Let's come back later, perhaps.
Yeah.
Why don't we move on to some more slides?
Yeah. I've got a lot of biases to cover, so
and get a random picture.
Yes. And then we should come back to some of these biases. As I say, I mean, these are all sensible questions to ask. It makes sense to look at these experiments and say, are they really showing what we want them to show? Are there other hypotheses to explain what's going on? Can we drill down to a better understanding of what's happening in our heads? And so I just have to tell you, I'm only showing you 2 experiments out of dozens and dozens that have explored just this one bias alone. Another bias, and again, I'm just going to give the rest of these just 1 or 2 experiments. Anchoring bias. So you invite your subjects into a room and you spin a wheel of fortune, and the wheel of fortune is numbered from 0 to 100. And you say, and the wheel of fortune stops at, say, 10. You go, okay, 10. So would you guess there are more or fewer than 10% of the countries in the United Nations are African countries? And people say, mostly I guess people would guess there are more than 10% in the United Nations. And so the second question is, okay, how many countries, what percentage of countries in the United Nations do you think are African countries? And people take a guess, they say, and the guess is median out around 25%. Then the second set of subjects, the Wheel of Fortune stops at 65%, because of course the Wheel of Fortune is rigged. This is a psychological experiment, never trust a psychologist. So it's rigged, it stops at 65%. As far as the subject is concerned, again, it's just a random spin of the wheel. And they say, I suppose there are less than 65% of African countries in the United Nations, perhaps. And then you say, okay, what would your guess be? How many African nations do you think are in the United Nations? And they guess, now, their guesses are more like 45%. So their guess has leapt up by a full 20%, it's nearly doubled, just because you provided a different anchor, just because the Wheel of Fortune that you showed them at the start of the experiment stopped at a different place. Suddenly their guesses of the number of African countries in the United Nations has doubled. Now you can absolutely see how, as you say, in the evolutionary environment, these sorts of anchors provide useful heuristics for guessing what might be going on. But there's a sense in which we're not able to switch those heuristics off. We're not able to sort of recognize that this is just a random Wheel of Fortune. It's not telling us anything about the African countries. It provides us with an anchor from which we adjust. And advertising, sorry, go ahead.
So more of a comment than a question.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating because that's an even better demonstration than the one of this experiment I've normally heard, where people, the argument against it that springs to people's minds when they hear it is, well, people might told the original figure of 10%, so they would assume that the other human had some useful information. They'd adjust their price accordingly.
Yes.
In this case, the Wheel of Fortune removes that. They
Yes.
see
it's made very clear to people.
Randomly chosen, but they still anchor on it.
They still anchor on it. And this is why supermarkets know this. This is why supermarkets will, if they want to sell you cheap beans, they'll put up a sign saying maximum 9 cans per customer. And you think, I don't want 9 cans. I only need 5, or 5 or 6. Whereas if you've just seen the cheap cans of beans, you think, I'll get 3 of those. And we know that it seems that people start off from the anchor and they adjust towards the number they're eventually going to give. And you can measure it in seconds. People take longer to adjust further away from the anchor. You can test people, if you ask people what age did Gandhi die, and you provide them with an anchor, do you think it was less than 1,000? Even a ludicrous anchor like that will force people's estimates up. Do you think it was more than 3? That will force people's estimates down. It's an astonishing effect.
I'm glad you're not using your powers for evil.
I try not. We're trying to save the world, man. Scope neglect. See, this is the really scary one. I mean, there are 2 biases I think are the scariest in the world, and one of them is scope neglect. So this is a bunch of MBA students in the United States, some of whom are going on a school trip a university trip to Thailand. And they would say, well, how much would you pay for flight insurance? And so the first group